History doesn't erase people all at once. It erases them quietly. A name misspelled, a voice ignored, a woman left out of the record, even though the land still remembers her footsteps. The morning came softly, the way dangerous mornings often do. Oklahoma's plains stretched wide under a pale sky, dust floating low, as if the earth itself was breathing. There was no warning in the air, no thunder, no sign that this ordinary dawn would become the beginning of a long erasure. She stood alone at the edge of the land, wrapped in a thin shawl, watching the horizon wake up. The wind carried the familiar smell of soil, dry, iron-heavy, ancient. This ground had known her people long before fences tried to teach it new boundaries. She had learned early that land remembers, even when governments don't. Her parents had taught her stories, not from books, but from memory. Stories passed down at night when the fire burned low and the world felt smaller. Stories of forced journeys, of treaties signed in confidence and broken in daylight, of survival that never looked heroic enough to be celebrated, but was strong enough to last. Those stories lived in her bones. The officials who came through her region never asked about those stories. They arrived with clipboards and maps, with neat lines drawn across places that had never been empty. They called it progress. They said it with confidence, as if saying it enough times would make it true. But progress, she had learned, often meant disappearance for people like her. By the time she reached adulthood, the old ways had been pushed into corners, ceremonies whispered instead of sung, languages softened so they wouldn't be punished, names shortened to make others comfortable. It wasn't hatred that did the damage, it was convenience, and convenience leaves no witnesses. Still, she stayed. Not because she was fearless, but because leaving felt like a second death. The first had already happened quietly, when the world decided she mattered less than paper. Her home was modest. The walls carried the smell of smoke and seasons. Outside, the land rolled endlessly, deceptively calm. From a distance, it looked empty, but she knew better. She knew every bend, every rise, every place where water gathered after rain. She knew the land because the land had raised her. When the notices began arriving, they were polite at first, folded carefully, delivered without eye contact. Temporary relocation, they said, administrative necessity, adjustments for development, words designed to sound harmless. She read them slowly, understanding exactly what they meant: leave or be removed. This wasn't new. Her ancestors had walked that road before, had buried children along it, had learned what temporary meant when spoken by men with power and no memory. She folded the paper and set it down. No. That single refusal, quiet, unannounced, would become the reason her name would later vanish from official records. The elders warned her gently. Resistance invited attention. Attention invited punishment. The system did not like interruptions, especially from women, especially from indigenous women who refused to disappear politely. But fear changes shape when you've already lost enough. She began asking questions that made officials uncomfortable. She requested explanations that were never meant to be given. She memorized names, dates, conversations. Memory became her shield. That was when the pressure started. Supplies delayed without explanation, access restricted, permissions denied, a slow tightening that never announced itself, the violence of bureaucracy, clean, bloodless, and devastating. Neighbors began to drift away. Some complied, some couldn't afford not to. Survival makes cowards of good people, and she understood that. But isolation is how resistance is broken. Rumors followed her. She was difficult, uncooperative, a problem. Words designed to make others step back instead of standing beside her. Still, she stayed. If stories like this matter to you, stories history tried to bury, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is exactly why they wanted her forgotten. One night, as the wind pressed hard against her walls, she understood the truth with painful clarity. This was no longer about land, it was about proof. As long as she remained, she proved something dangerous, that survival didn't require permission, that erasure could be resisted, that memory could outlive law, and the system could not allow that. The rememberers are always more threatening than the rebels. When dawn came again, the air felt heavier. The land was still the same, but the silence had changed. It carried intent. She stood outside once more, feet planted in the dust, knowing something was coming, knowing the cost would be high, knowing history would not be kind. But she stayed anyway. Because some people are willing to disappear from records if it means refusing to disappear from truth. And that choice, made in quiet defiance, would follow her long after the world stopped saying her name. For years, it had been her armor. Say less, watch more. Let the wind carry what it will. The land taught her that lesson long before men in coats and badges tried to explain it. Silence could keep you alive when the world decided you were inconvenient. But silence only works until the moment it is mistaken for surrender. The first sign came disguised as routine. A man arrived with papers folded so precisely they looked ceremonial. He spoke gently, as if gentleness could soften the meaning of his words. He explained that the area was being reorganized, that boundaries were being clarified, that compliance would make everything easier for everyone involved. Easier was the word he leaned on. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question, quiet, exact, impossible to ignore. Where do we go? The man shifted. His eyes flicked to the horizon, then back to the page, as if the answer might be printed there if he stared long enough. He said something about temporary arrangements, about assistance, about opportunity elsewhere. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because she understood. There was no elsewhere. That night, the elders gathered. The room smelled of smoke and old wood. No one raised their voice. They didn't need to. Everyone in that room had heard these promises before, carried in the mouths of men who never stayed to see the consequences. Some argued for compliance. They had children to feed, crops to protect. They had learned, painfully, that resistance often meant hunger. Others looked to her. She did not speak at first. She waited until the room settled, until the weight of choice pressed evenly on every shoulder. "If we leave," she said finally, "they will say we agreed, and once they say that, we are gone forever." The room went quiet. This was the moment silence became dangerous. Within weeks, the pressure escalated. Notices multiplied, deadlines appeared where none had existed before. The language sharpened. What had once been requests hardened into expectations. She felt it everywhere, in the way supplies arrived late, in the way officials no longer used her name, in the way neighbors stopped meeting her eyes, not out of cruelty, but fear. Fear spreads faster than truth. The system didn't need to convince everyone, it only needed to convince enough people to step aside. Still, she stayed. She began documenting everything, conversations, dates, the names of men who believed their authority made them invisible. She knew records could be altered, but memory, passed carefully, could not. One afternoon, she was summoned to an office that smelled of ink and dust. The walls were bare except for a flag and a clock that ticked too loudly. The man behind the desk spoke with the practiced calm of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. He told her she was obstructing progress. She asked him to define progress. He did not appreciate the question. That's when the tone changed. Her refusal was no longer seen as stubbornness, it was labeled defiance, and defiance, in a system built on control, must be corrected. Word spread quickly after that. She was warned, unofficially, quietly, that staying would make things worse, that she could be made an example, that history favors those who knew when to step aside. History, she knew, favors those who control the pen. If you're still listening, take a second and subscribe. Stories like this survived because someone refused to look away, and because others chose to keep listening. The community began to fracture. Families made private decisions. Some left at night, packing what they could carry, believing distance might spare them. Others stayed but stopped speaking publicly, hoping invisibility would protect them. Isolation settled around her like fog. Then came the day they stopped pretending. They arrived early, before the sun had fully burned through the mist. No shouting, no chaos, just authority moving with confidence. They told her she had hours, not days, hours. She stood in the doorway of her home, the land behind her stretching wide and silent. She thought of the stories her parents had told, of ancestors who had been forced to walk until the land no longer knew their names. She did not move. What followed was never written down properly. Official records would later describe it as a voluntary departure, a peaceful resolution, necessary action taken in accordance with policy. Those who were there remembered something else. They remembered hands that pushed instead of guided, voices that hardened when resistance did not crumble, the quiet humiliation of being removed from a place your body still recognized as home. She survived it, but survival came at a cost. When it was over, her home stood empty. The land remained, but she was no longer allowed to stand on it. By evening, her name began disappearing from lists, misspelled first, then omitted entirely. Erasure doesn't happen all at once. It happens one line at a time. That night, far from the land that raised her, she sat awake listening to the wind move through unfamiliar trees. The silence felt different now. It no longer protected her. It surrounded her. But something else had changed too. The system had succeeded in removing her, but it had failed to remove what she represented. Stories began moving where she no longer could. Whispered accounts, remembered details, names passed carefully from mouth to mouth. The kind of history that survives because it refuses to be written by the same hands that tried to erase it. She had lost the land, but the land had not lost her. And the consequences of that refusal, quiet, stubborn, unforgettable, were only beginning to unfold. That once she was gone, the land would quiet itself. That the stories would thin out, soften, lose their edges the way all inconvenient memories eventually do. Power depends on forgetting. It always has. But forgetting didn't come. In the weeks after she was forced away, the land changed hands with unnatural speed. Boundaries shifted overnight. Senses appeared where paths once ran. Names unfamiliar to the soil were written onto deeds that smelled of fresh ink and old ambition. On paper, everything looked clean. In reality, something was wrong. The people who remained felt it first. The land felt restless. Crops struggled in places that had always grown easily. Wells turned shallow. The wind carried dust heavier than before, as if the earth itself resisted being claimed by strangers. They spoke her name quietly at first, not out of rebellion, but recognition. She had not vanished the way the system expected. Instead, she lingered, in memory, in conversations held after sunset, in warnings given to children about what happens when you let someone else define your worth. Far from the land, she lived in a kind of exile that never quite became home. The place she was sent to accepted her presence, but never truly saw her. She was a woman without paperwork that matched her memory, without records that reflected her past. To the system, she had become administratively irrelevant. To the people, she had become something else entirely, a witness. Life grew smaller. Work was harder to find when your name carried rumors of resistance. Doors closed politely. Assistance came with conditions. Silence was expected now, not as protection, but as penance. She learned quickly that survival after resistance is a different kind of struggle. Some nights, she wondered if staying had been worth it, if the land would have remembered her anyway, even if she had left quietly. Doubt has a way of sneaking in when the world stops watching. But then letters arrived. Not official ones, handwritten, folded unevenly, messages from people she had once known or people who only knew of her. They thanked her. They told her she had given them courage. They told her she stayed longer because she did. Those letters mattered. They reminded her that resistance doesn't always win, but it always leaves evidence. The system responded the only way it knew. It tightened. Officials began discouraging mention of her name. Records referencing the removal were misplaced. Testimonies contradicted each other in ways that felt rehearsed. The story was being rewritten carefully, deliberately. She was no longer described as a person. She was described as an issue. And issues, once resolved, are meant to disappear. If you're still here, listening, subscribe, because this is the part of the story history never admits to writing. Years passed. Her body aged faster than she expected. Exile carries its own weight. But her mind stayed sharp, alert to the way power moved. She noticed patterns, how other names vanished, how other communities were softened into statistics. She wasn't unique. She was part of a design. That realization changed something in her. She stopped thinking of her story as personal. It wasn't just about land anymore, or even about memory. It was about structure, about how easily lives were folded into margins when they refused to fit the narrative. She began speaking again, not publicly, not loudly, but intentionally, teaching younger ones how to remember, how to document without paper, how to pass truth in ways that couldn't be confiscated. Stories became her shelter, and stories, unlike land, can't be fenced. The system noticed, but too late. By the time officials realized her influence hadn't ended with her removal, the damage was already done. Her name was circulating again, not in records, but in resistance, in lessons taught quietly, in warnings passed like heirlooms. They could no longer remove her without acknowledging her, so they chose something worse. They erased her entirely. Her name was omitted from revisions, her existence reframed as rumor. Later documents contradicted earlier ones so thoroughly that truth became uncertain, and uncertainty, when cultivated long enough, becomes dismissal. This was the price of being remembered. Not martyrdom, not justice, but deliberate obscurity. She lived the rest of her life knowing history would never give her back what it had taken, but she also knew something else. History is not the same as memory. History is written by power. Memory is kept by people, and people were still speaking. When she died, There was no announcement, no acknowledgement, no correction made to the record. She passed quietly as she had lived, unrecognized by institutions, remembered by hearts. The land she once stood on no longer bore her name, but those who walked it said the air still felt different there, that certain places carried weight, that some paths felt watched over. They told their children that once a woman stood there and refused to move. That was enough, because resistance doesn't always leave monuments. Sometimes it leaves instructions. And those instructions, how to stay, how to refuse, how to remember, would shape what came next.
Long enough for people to forget where it began. Long enough for lies to settle into something that looks like truth. Long enough for absence to feel natural. For decades, that silence held. The land kept changing hands. Roads were laid where footpaths once wound gently through grass. New names replaced old ones, spoken with confidence by people who had never learned what came before. To them, the land had always been empty, waiting. But land is patient, not empty. Beneath the surface, memory waited. The first crack came quietly, the way all real reckonings do. Not from courts or officials, but from children asking questions their teachers couldn't answer cleanly. Why did the map look wrong? Why did the stories not match the place? Why did elders go quiet when certain names were spoken? In kitchens and back rooms, the old ones began speaking again, carefully at first, as if testing whether the world was ready to hear what it had ignored. They told of a woman who refused to move. They didn't always agree on details. Time blurs edges, but they agreed on the core truth. She stayed when staying was dangerous. She spoke when silence was expected, and for that, she was removed. Those stories traveled slowly. They always do. Passed across generations like fragile glass, handled with care. Some listeners dismissed them as exaggeration. Others leaned in closer, sensing there was something here that had never been properly addressed. Meanwhile, the official record remained smooth. Too smooth. That's what caught the attention of a few historians years later. Scholars who noticed gaps where there shouldn't have been any. Names that appeared once and never again. Decisions recorded without explanation. Absence, when examined closely, can be louder than presence. They searched archives, found contradictions, reports that didn't align, entire events reduced to vague phrasing, resolved, relocated, adjusted, words that explained nothing. The woman's name appeared only in fragments, misspelled, reassigned, erased between drafts. That kind of erasure isn't accidental, it's deliberate. As questions resurfaced, the silence that had protected the system began to work against it, because silence, once broken, has a way of echoing. Community members who had never spoken publicly before began sharing what they remembered. Descendants came forward with letters, stories, warnings passed down not as history, but as instruction. They said, "Remember this, because it will happen again." The land itself seemed to cooperate. Areas once dismissed as insignificant became sites of interest. Old boundaries didn't match the stories officials told. Paths led nowhere on maps, but somewhere in memory. What emerged wasn't a clean narrative. It never is. It was something messier and more honest. a picture of resistance that had been deliberately softened, then buried. If you're still listening, subscribe, because this is where forgotten stories stop asking permission to exist. As the truth began surfacing, the response was predictable. Some denied it outright, said the stories were exaggerated, misremembered, inconvenient. They leaned on the absence of documentation as proof, ignoring that absence was the very thing under scrutiny. Others were quieter, uncomfortable, because acknowledging her meant acknowledging the system that erased her. And systems do not like mirrors. Public discussions followed, articles written carefully, cautiously. No one wanted to accuse directly. No one wanted to name responsibility. But something had shifted. The silence no longer felt neutral. It felt complicit. The woman's story began appearing in lectures, then classrooms, not as a footnote, but as an example of how erasure works, of how resistance doesn't always look like victory, but endurance. Students asked why they'd never heard of her before. There was no good answer. The truth was simple and damning, because her story disrupted the narrative that progress had been clean, that removal had been peaceful, that compliance had been universal. She proved otherwise, and proof is dangerous. As more people learned her name, something unexpected happened. The story stopped belonging to any one group. It became a lens, a way of understanding how power behaves when challenged quietly. She was no longer just a woman removed from land. She became a reminder that systems depend more on cooperation than force, and that refusal, even when it fails, leaves scars. Her absence had been engineered, but absence, once noticed, becomes presence. The land, too, began to speak in its own way. Old markers resurfaced, property lines were questioned, development projects stalled under scrutiny. The past, once pushed aside, had become inconvenient again, not because it demanded restoration, but because it demanded honesty. And honesty threatens comfort. By the time the silence fully broke, it was too late to put everything back the way it had been, but it was early enough to change what came next. Her story began shaping new conversations about memory, about whose voices are trusted, about how easily injustice hides behind paperwork. She had been erased, but not completely, because people remembered, and memory, once awakened, does not go back to sleep easily. Still, there was one final truth waiting beneath it all. The system that removed her had never truly been dismantled, only renamed. A different era, different laws, different attitudes. That belief was comforting. It allowed distance. It allowed relief. If her suffering was historical, then it was also finished. But the deeper researchers looked, the harder that belief became to maintain. Because her story wasn't an exception, it was a template. The same language appeared again and again in different decades, different states, different communities. Adjustment, relocation, administrative necessity, words that sounded neutral until you followed where they led. They always led away from home. What happened to her wasn't a single injustice. It was a method, one refined through repetition, quiet enough to avoid outrage, legal enough to avoid accountability, slow enough that resistance fractured before it could unify. And once you see a method, you start seeing it everywhere. Communities displaced for development projects, neighborhoods revitalized until the people who built them could no longer afford to live there, cultural spaces renamed, repurposed, repackaged, history scrubbed clean for convenience. Different faces, same structure. Her story became a warning not because it was unique, but because it was familiar. people began asking harder questions, not just about what happened to her, but about what was still happening now. Who benefits when memory is lost? Who gains when silence is rewarded? Those questions made institutions uncomfortable because acknowledging her meant acknowledging continuity, that the system didn't end, it adapted. Some officials tried to honor her story symbolically. Plaques were proposed, statements drafted, carefully worded acknowledgments that praised resilience without naming responsibility. It was history without consequence. Others pushed back harder. They argued that revisiting old wounds only created division, that progress required moving forward, not looking back. But you cannot move forward honestly if you don't know where you've been. Her story refused to stay symbolic. Descendants spoke publicly now, no longer whispering. They connected her experience to their own, to land disputes still unresolved, to cultural losses still felt, to identities still questioned. She became a bridge between generations, not because she wanted to be, but because the system forced her to carry that weight. If this story is hitting closer to home than expected, subscribe, because what comes next isn't comfortable, but it's necessary. The most unsettling realization came quietly. People began to understand that the system didn't require cruelty to function. It required cooperation. Paperwork signed because resistance was exhausting, silence chosen because survival demanded it, acceptance offered because fighting felt futile. Her refusal disrupted that flow. And that disruption, small, localized, imperfect, was enough to expose the system's fragility. Because systems built on erasure depend on everyone agreeing to forget. Once forgetting fails, control weakens. That's why her story mattered now more than ever, not as inspiration, but as instruction. She showed that resistance doesn't always win immediately. Sometimes it loses visibly, sometimes it costs everything. But it plants something that outlives defeat: memory. And memory changes behavior. Communities began organizing differently, documenting everything, teaching children not just dates but patterns, how to read between official lines, how to recognize when language is being used to soften harm. Her story was no longer just about her. It was about vigilance. But there was still one problem. Recognition without action becomes another form of erasure, and many were content to stop at recognition. They spoke her name now, but carefully. They praised her courage, but abstractly. They remembered her story, but resisted its implications, because implications demand change, and change threatens comfort. The land she was taken from remained under different ownership. Legal processes moved too slowly to matter. Justice, when filtered through institutions that benefited from injustice, arrived diluted, if at all. She had warned them without ever speaking directly. This is how it happens: quietly, politely, legally. And unless someone interrupts the process, it keeps happening. Her story reached a point where it could no longer be ignored, but it could still be misunderstood, romanticized, softened, turned into a lesson without teeth. That was the final danger, not forgetting her, but misunderstanding her. She was not a symbol of peaceful loss. She was a record of forced removal. She was not a story of inevitable progress. She was proof that progress can be violent when questioned. And she was not just a woman of the past, she was a warning for the present. The question was no longer whether people knew her story. The question was what they would do with it. Because memory alone is not resistance. Action is.
The name had been spoken. The silence broken. The record, at least partially, corrected. For some, that felt like justice, or close enough to it. They could finally exhale, convinced that remembering was the same as repairing. It wasn't. Because her legacy was never about being acknowledged. It was about being answered.
She had not stood her ground so that future generations could simply nod solemnly and move on. She had stayed because staying mattered, because refusal, even when it fails, draws a line the future must reckon with. And reckoning is never comfortable. As her story settled into public consciousness, something subtle happened. People began asking what responsibility looked like now. Not in theory, not symbolically, but materially, legally, socially. That's where resistance usually stalls, because responsibility costs something. Institutions that had slowly warmed to her story now hesitated. Commissions were proposed, studies announced, language softened again. The same machinery that once erased her tried to absorb her, turn her into a lesson rather than a challenge. She had seen this coming. Her resistance was never dramatic. It was precise. She understood systems because she had lived inside their pressure. She knew that power adapts faster than outrage fades. Which is why her true legacy was not the story itself, but the habits it demanded. She demanded vigilance. She demanded that people look twice at paperwork that claimed neutrality, that they question timelines that skip inconvenient years, that they listen when communities say, "This has happened before." Most of all, she demanded continuity. Not remembrance once a year, not a name spoken when it was safe, but sustained attention, the kind that interrupts momentum. The hardest truth to accept was this: nothing about her story guaranteed a happy ending. The land was not fully returned. The harm was not fully undone. The system that removed her still existed, refined and renamed, operating under newer language and broader authority. Her legacy was not victory, it was clarity, and clarity forces choice. People began to split, not along political lines, but along lines of comfort. Some wanted closure, others wanted change. Some were content to say that was wrong, without asking, what now? She would have recognized that divide immediately, because it was the same one she faced. Those who wanted peace at any cost, and those who understood that peace without justice is just quiet harm. Her descendants, biological and otherwise, carried that tension forward. Some became educators, some organizers, some simply refused to forget in a world that constantly pushed them to. They didn't all agree on methods, but they agreed on one thing: her story could not be allowed to end neatly, because neat endings are how systems escape accountability. If you're still here, listening to the very end, subscribe. Not for the algorithm, but because stories like this only matter if they continue to be carried. Over time, her name began appearing more consistently. Still not everywhere, still not centrally, but no longer invisible. That mattered, but it wasn't enough. What mattered more was that people began recognizing the pattern when it appeared again. A community labeled underutilized, a relocation framed as opportunity, a protest dismissed as disruption. Once you've seen the method, you can't unsee it. That was her final gift. She taught people how to recognize erasure while it's happening, not decades later when apologies are cheaper. She taught that resistance doesn't need to be loud to be effective. It needs to be deliberate, persistent, unwilling to disappear politely. And she taught that history is not a fixed record. It's a negotiation, one that power expects to win unless challenged. Her life ended without ceremony, but her influence didn't. It lives in the way questions are asked now, in the way silence is treated with suspicion, in the refusal to accept "that's just how it was" as an answer. She never asked to be remembered. She asked to be heard. And hearing her means accepting something uncomfortable, that the past is not past, that the systems we inherit still carry the logic of the systems that came before, that justice delayed is not justice softened, it's justice denied. Her story does not resolve into inspiration, it resolves into responsibility, and responsibility is heavier than remembrance. The land still remembers her footsteps, the people still carry her refusal, and the future, whether it listens or not, has already been warned. This was never just her story. It was instructions left behind by someone who understood that erasure only works if everyone agrees to forget. She didn't forget. Now the choice belongs to us.
If you're ready for more real talk about getting video, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell.